Hi everyone. Today's episode is sure to blow your socks off. I have 3 stories that reveal fascinating information that will make you wonder if the things you know are really true. You might even reconsider everything you've ever learned. But first, please snuggle up and pull your socks up tight, then get to know that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. I've lived on this ranch here in North Dakota my entire life. In fact, my great-grandfather settled this land. His family came over from the old country in the mid-1800s, so you could say I know it like the back of my hand. The truth is that my entire life I've been hearing strange stories of a creature that supposedly haunts these parts. It's said to be a giant black dog, or sometimes a wolf-like creature. In fact, my grandfather used to tell me stories of how when he was a boy, his father would take him out hunting these creatures. But they never found one. Supposedly, they are quite smart and very dangerous. It's been said that the creature is some sort of a demon or a spirit that's been trapped on our land. Others say it's just a regular animal or a weird hybrid that's made its home in the dense forests that are nearby. Either way, I always make sure to be extra careful when I'm out at night. But this is just part of the legend of this place. And I never thought much of it since I've been hearing it since I was a boy. Until one night, everything changed. One summer night about a decade ago, I was out checking on the horses in the barn. The night was still, but you could still hear the rustlings of spring and the movements of animals in the trees. It had always been my job to make sure everything was as it should be before bed, and so I was out, diligently doing my duties. Now, to give you a clear vision, the barn is over 100 years old, but it had been built so solidly from rocks dug up from our land that it will no doubt be standing for long into the future, probably long after I'm gone. However, despite its solid foundation, the wooden plank walls have a few cracks between the boards, and those can let in moonlight, and they always give the inside of the barn this eerie glow. That was the one thing I hated about checking on the barn at night. So anyway, as I was walking through the barn for one last check, I heard a noise coming from the far end, like a loud shriek, but quick and almost gone by the time I tuned into it. It had come from the opposite end of the barn from where I had entered. I knew it wasn't the ranch hands or any of the other workers because they were all finished for the night. I had even said goodnight to some of them and teased one about getting up on time in the morning. So I knew for sure that they weren't there. The noise was familiar, and yet strange at the same time. I thought maybe one of my horses had been spooked or was kicking up a fuss. I had brought our family dog Bruno. I did that every night just to be safe, because he's fiercely protective and loyal. The full moon that night made it so that I could see most everything, even though I was totally spooked as I walked through those streams of light coming in from between the boards. I inched slowly along, looking left and right and trying to decipher what I had heard and what was going on in there. So, as soon as I got closer to the opposite side, I heard the noise again, and I verified that I was getting closer. It was definitely coming from the far back part of the barn, which is also the area where the horses were sounding really upset. So now I'm thinking that maybe a coyote or something had gotten inside and spooked them. But I wasn't seeing one or any signs of one. I stood there and tried to focus as best as possible towards the sound, still being helped by the light streaming into the barn and peeking through the cracks in a way that almost made the barn look like it was alive. I watched as the dust swirled through the moonlight, adding to my strange feelings. And I remember wishing that this was all over and that it had been nothing. At this point, I turned on the flashlight I had brought, and I got a good look at the horses. I could now see their eyes, and they were all moving around in panic, looking agitated in their stalls with their eyes open wide and bulging. I knew from the looks on their faces that I needed to be careful, because something dangerous was definitely lurking around. And then I heard Bruno growling, and I turned towards him to see him standing in the front of an open doorway of one of the smaller stalls. His hackles were raised and his teeth were bared. I stepped forward to see what he was growling at, and there, in the beam of light from my flashlight, I saw the most horrifying creature that I have ever seen in my life. It was standing there, just inside the stall, its eyes glowing a bright, sinister amberish color. It was easily the size of a horse, and it had this long snout with sharp teeth and black fur that was matted and greasy. This was definitely something wild or feral. It just didn't match up with anything that one would normally find in a barn stall, even including wild animals that might break in for the night. Of course, my brain went on overload and I couldn't process what I was seeing. So for a few moments, I just stood there, paralyzed with fear. I thought for sure that this wild and rough-looking creature was going to lunge at me, either to hurt me or to get past me. I mean, it had no other direction to go. I could definitely feel that this situation was not good at all. But as soon as it saw me, it locked eyes with me, and then it stood up straighter than before, on its hind legs, and I watched it grow taller than I ever thought possible. And now I could see it more clearly because my light was shining right in its face. It had reddish-brown fur and that long snout. This creature was not anything I had ever seen before, at least not in person. The most disorienting part was its eyes that glowed back at me, reflecting the beam from my flashlight in a way that could practically slice the darkness. And the thing had this look of pure evil on its face. It didn't take me long to realize that I was looking at the creature that up until now had just been a legend to me. I knew that it was the creature from the stories, from the history of this land. I remember noticing that I couldn't breathe and that my heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I wanted to run, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. Somewhere in the back of my mind, as if I was hearing it through water, I could hear Bruno still barking, but I couldn't tell you where he was if my life depended on it. The only thing that I could do was stand there and stare at this thing, with my mind swirling. It just stood there looking back at me, and then it did something that I will never forget, that I will never be able to explain. It tilted its head to the side, and it just looked at me for a long moment, and then it jumped right out of the stall, over the wall and past me and into the empty stall next to it, and then it sprinted out of the barn. It literally scaled the stall wall and practically flew through the air towards the open doors. I spun to watch it run as my flashlight shone on its back with the streams of moonlight flickering on its fur as it ran through them, and then it was gone. I don't know what made me do it, but I ran after it. My legs just took off without me consciously deciding to go. I sprinted out of the barn in the direction that it had run. I even called out for it to stop. Bruno was with me, barking the whole time. But the thing was gone. Even he couldn't follow its scent. I ran all around the ranch looking for signs of it, but I couldn't find anything. It had just vanished into the night. After about 10 minutes of watching for it to reappear, I admitted to myself that it was gone. It had outwitted us, and it had gotten away without a trace. Even the horses seemed to be calming down a bit as if they sensed it was gone too. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing was still watching us, waiting for its chance to come back. It was the stillness of the night that made me feel that way. Sounds in the trees had stopped, and now there was just this eerie silence in the land. Bruno and I eventually went inside the house and I locked all the doors. No surprise, I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I went out to check on the property again to see if I could find some clues. I found footprints, big prints in the soft earth near the barn, but they stopped at the edge of the property, and then nothing. No more clues. I still have no idea what happened that night in the barn, but I know that it was real. I know that I wasn't dreaming and that I didn't imagine it. I saw the creature with my own eyes, and it was definitely not anything friendly. It was a wild animal, predator. It wanted to kill something. I'm sure of it. In a way, I'm almost glad that I saw this thing. It's really made me more alert and careful. I'm extra cautious now too, and I don't leave anything to chance. I feel that I and my family and the ranch are all safer now because of my heightened caution. I know it's strange to feel safer after seeing one of these, but if you lived the life I do, taking care of so many living creatures, it's good to know exactly what you're up against. But still, I'll never forget that night in the barn and the terror that I felt as I watched it standing there, just looking at me. I can honestly state that horrifying creatures do exist, and they're out there, waiting in the dark. I've been excited to share my story with you because I think it's a bit different than all the rest I've ever heard. You see, even though I have had several encounters with some really strange things in my life that I can't really put into words, I have never been afraid of them. I feel protected by them, actually. But one day in the fall of 2015, I had an encounter that was a little different from those others, mainly because of how the thing I encountered acted towards me. At the time, I was 20 years old and I lived in a house on the outskirts of Saugus, California. I had left my parents' home and I was renting this place with 2 other girls, one whose name was Roxy. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning and Roxy and I were driving home after going to see some friends play at a music festival down near LA. I was driving because Roxy's car was in the shop, and anyway, she always liked when I drove. We were blasting music while we drove when suddenly she said, "Hey, what's that?" At first I didn't know what she meant, but I saw her looking back. So I glanced in the rearview mirror, and then I saw it too. Something moving behind us along the side of the highway, darting in and out next to the guardrail. It looked like a big dog or maybe even a coyote, but why that didn't make sense was that it was walking on 2 legs, and it was fast. It was keeping pace with us, even though it was staying about 50 yards behind. I slowed down a bit so we could get a better look and see what was exactly going on. And that's when I heard Roxy yell, "It's coming at us!" Sure enough, the thing started running even more quickly, towards our car now that we were slowing down. And the image that really sticks in my mind about this part was that it looked like it was grinning, smiling, or maybe it was smirking in a way it knew it had the upper hand. I'm not sure why it was making that expression, but either way, the way its mouth looked was insane. And just as we were trying to get a good look at it, it passed under one of the big lights along the side of the road. And I could see that this thing was not a normal animal at all. I could now even see horns that I hadn't been able to make out when it was further back. I know that sounds crazy, but they looked like goat horns. And like I said, this thing was tall, with dark brown fur all over its body except for the white parts of skin that were showing in some spots, like around the eyes. Another confusing part was that I could now see that it was running actually on its toes. And when I say that, I mean it looked like it was running with its feet pointed down, or maybe like it had hooves or something like that. All I could think was that this thing had come straight from the devil. Later, Roxy said that she had had the same thought, which makes me think we might have been correct about that, even though I don't know how we both had the same random thought at the same time. One thing is for sure, though, it scared the hell out of both of us, especially when it started to make strange sounds. At first, I thought it was growling, but then I realized that the sounds were not growls, but they had some sort of a regulated cadence. I honestly then thought that this creature was speaking to me in some unknown language, at least unknown to me. Roxy said she could hear it too, but all she heard were buzzing sounds, and she couldn't decide if it was actually a language or not. But whatever this thing did with its voice made my car shake, and it made it difficult for me to stay in control. It was at this point that I floored it, and I sped off as fast as I could back to our house. Once we got home, Roxy ran inside to use the bathroom, and she barfed everywhere. She was so sick from what had happened. But for whatever reason, I now wasn't scared. I was actually excited. Roxy thought I was crazy, and she made that very clear as we told our other roommate what had happened. But as we told her, she became super worried that something might have followed us home, and she couldn't stop thinking that it could be lurking around the house. I thought that idea was crazy, but she seemed scared enough that we all went outside to check. We went with flashlights, and we looked all over the place. I even kept my mace in my hand just in case, but we didn't see anything unusual. However, we did hear strange noises coming from the hillside across the street. It sounded like a cross between a dog barking and this weird moaning sound. The whole thing freaked us out, so we all went back inside and locked up tight for the night. A few days later, Roxy got her car back from the shop and started driving herself places again. She then told me that while she was driving home one night from work, she saw that same creature standing on top of a hill near where we had seen it before. She said it was just standing there, looking at her, and she had to drive past it and hold it together, hoping the whole time that it didn't react to her or recognize her. Obviously, I don't know why that thing was there, but I'm glad Roxy got through it okay. As for me, I haven't seen that devil creature again since that night, but I do feel the presence of some really strange energies in the area around our house. I'm convinced that I'm sensing that creature's presence. I'm sort of like that anyway, really sensitive to energies and such, and not really afraid, just curious. Thanks for listening to the story. If you want, you can use my name, which is Christine, on your site, and if you think it's okay and safe to do that. I look forward to seeing if you post this or not, and what other people think about it. I live in a very suburban neighborhood in northern Michigan that's just like any neighborhood, really. We had chosen the house because it's on a cul-de-sac and it was safe for the kids to play outside. The rear of the house backs up to a natural open space area, which was another plus for us so we could take the kids on nature walks. What we didn't know when we moved in was that our neighbor to the west of us seemed a little strange. He was very paranoid all the time. He had an abnormal number of motion sensor lights on his house, and his window blinds always seemed to be closed. He even had a strand of barbed wire all along the top of his backyard fence. The first time I met him, he was outside putting salt around his house. He was lugging around a 10-pound bag of coarse salt. We had barely introduced ourselves, and he was trying to give me some salt, too. He said you never know when the horned beast will come back. I thought then that maybe he was some kind of religious fanatic and was talking about the devil. But he said he had noticed these footprints in his backyard the last time it snowed, and that was when he put up the barbed wire. So it sounded like he was talking about a physical beast. I tried to ask him some questions, but he said it wasn't good to talk about it too much. I don't like to judge, but I figured he had lost a few marbles. I know that some of my own relatives have gotten a little weird when they've been cooped up for so long. One evening I was in the kitchen cooking or doing dishes when I heard this low rumbling sound. I turned around and I saw my 60-pound bull terrier facing the door to the backyard, growling like I had never seen him do before. His hackles were fully raised and his body was rigid and shaking. His lips were curled and he was baring all of his teeth. He was taking in these big breaths and snarling. I'd never seen him like that before. I'd seen him bark and growl at neighborhood cats, but nothing like this. He's mostly muscle. He looked really intimidating. I was thinking, what the hell is out there? I was home alone, so there shouldn't have been anybody out there. So I grabbed a big kitchen knife and I opened the door a bit. When the door was about halfway open, I was hit with this horrible, rotting meat smell. My mind was scrambling for a reason. I started thinking, did the lids get blown off the garbage cans? But no way would the garbage cans ever smell like that. Not that bad. And I hadn't put anything like that in them. It was a truly putrid smell. I figured I'd better get out there to check it out, though. If some animal had gotten stuck in my yard, I didn't want it tearing anything up. And anyway, my poor dog needed to calm down. It was around dusk, so I could see out there a little, but it was verging on pretty dark. I poked my head out the door and I heard a rustling sound and the sound of branches breaking. I looked toward the back fence and I thought I saw antlers. Well, we had tons of deer in the area and they often were out at dusk, so that wasn't anything unusual. But the rustling noise kept going, so I was wondering if maybe it had gotten its antlers stuck in the fence. I didn't feel capable of releasing a trapped deer, but I couldn't just ignore it, especially with my dog going nuts. Now that was weird because he was used to seeing deer all the time. I wanted to get a closer look before I called animal rescue in case I was wrong. I managed to squeeze out the door without letting the dog out, but when I got out there, the dog went even more ballistic. He was actually jumping up and clawing at the door like he was trying to tear it down. Now that should have clued me in, because my dog does not act like that. He's a big, lovable goof. Listen to your dogs, people. My backyard slopes up to the back fence, which is about 60 feet from the back door. So I started walking up there, and when I got within 20 feet, I just stopped dead in my tracks. They were definitely antlers, but it definitely was not a deer. This antlered head turned toward me and looked at me with these horrible yellow eyes. The eyes were like glowing out of these hollow sockets, and the head looked like some kind of skull. It looked like it had the legs of a deer, but it was standing upright, and it was tall, at least 7 feet tall. It was so skinny, too, and it looked so unreal, but I'm telling you, it was real. Looking at it, I felt icy cold, even though it wasn't cold outside. While it was looking at me, I just felt hollowed out somehow, hopeless. I managed to turn around and run back into the house. I got in the door, and I had to use all my strength to hold my dog back and slam the door and lock it. I fell to the ground and just sobbed into my dog's fur. He was still lunging and barking his head off, but I just held on to him tight. After about 5 minutes, he finally did calm down. I turned on the backyard floodlights and looked out there through the window. It seemed to be gone. I couldn't even think. There was no reference in my brain for such a thing. Do you have any idea what it was?